They say a man builds his castle brick by brick, thinking he's building strength, security, a place to weather any storm. But sometimes a man builds himself a different kind of structure, one made of routine and comfort, of sameness. He doesn't see the walls rising around him, doesn't notice the windows slowly boarding up because the air inside is warm, predictable. And he calls it peace. He calls it success. He calls it home. Until one day, the ceiling starts to feel a little too low, the light a little too dim, and he realizes he hasn't built a castle at all. He's built a cage, and the quiet comfort has become a slow kind of poison, dulling the edge of everything. That kind of quiet poison had been working on Hector for years, though he wouldn't have called it poison back then. To him, it was just life. Hector, at 48, was a man carved from the industrial landscape of his hometown, as solid and unyielding as the concrete floor of the factory where he spent his days. You wouldn't notice him right away in a crowd, and that was just how he liked it. He moved with a practiced economy, each step purposeful, each gesture carrying the weight of experience. He was one of those men who made the world run, the kind who showed up every single day, no matter what, and simply got the job done. His face was a roadmap of a life lived mostly indoors, under the relentless hum of fluorescent lights. The lines around his eyes weren't from laughter, not primarily anyway. They were etched there by years of squinting at schematics, of staring at repetitive tasks, of the steady, grinding focus demanded by the assembly line. There was a quiet determination in those eyes, an unspoken promise of reliability, but beneath it, if you looked close enough, was a deep, bone-tired weariness that no amount of sleep seemed to fix. It was a weariness that settled in his shoulders, a slight, almost imperceptible slump that spoke of carrying more than just the weight of his shift. His hands, though, those were the real story. Thick-knuckled and calloused, cross-hatched with old scars and ingrained grease lines that no amount of scrubbing could truly erase. They were the hands of a man who knew the bite of cold steel, the tremor of heavy machinery, the exact weight of a wrench. They were strong, capable hands, the kind that could fix a leaky faucet, change a tire, or expertly guide a metal part into its precise slot on the line with an almost artistic grace born of repetition. You looked at those hands and you knew this wasn't a man who dodged work. This was a man who lived by it. He wore his work like a second skin, comfortable in its familiar grit and grime. He didn't complain. He just put his head down every day and kept turning the crank. They say the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. And for a lot of us, that ain't just about devils, it's about comfort. We build walls of routine around ourselves, brick by predictable brick, until we're living in a fortress of good enough. It feels safe, quiet, steady. The hum of the familiar can be a lullaby, but sometimes real quiet just means you're rotting slow. Sometimes that comfort ain't a shield, it's a cage. And you don't know you're locked in until something or someone rattles the bars so hard the whole damn thing shakes apart. That's where Hector was, stuck in his own quiet fortress. A factory man, 48 years old, his life measured in the rhythmic clank and hum of the assembly line. He looked like a man who'd seen a lot of hard days, the kind that wear a man down deep and settle into the very bones. He was the guy who showed up before the lights were fully on and left after everyone else had punched out, the one who didn't call in sick, no matter what, and simply got the job done. His face was a roadmap of a life lived mostly indoors, under the relentless hum of fluorescent lights. The lines around his eyes weren't from laughter, not primarily anyway. They were etched there by years of squinting at schematics, of staring at repetitive tasks, of the steady, grinding focus demanded by the assembly line. There was a quiet determination in those eyes, an unspoken promise of reliability, but beneath it, if you looked close enough, was a deep, bone-tired weariness that no amount of sleep seemed to fix. It was a weariness that settled in his shoulders, a slight, almost imperceptible slump that spoke of carrying more than just the weight of his shift. His hands, though, those were the real story. Thick-knuckled and calloused, cross-hatched with old scars and ingrained grease lines that no amount of scrubbing could truly erase. They were the hands of a man who knew the bite of cold steel, the tremor of heavy machinery, the exact weight of a wrench. They were strong, capable hands, the kind that could fix a leaky faucet, change a tire, or expertly guide a metal part into its precise slot on the line with an almost artistic grace born of repetition. You looked at those hands and you knew this wasn't a man who dodged work. This was a man who lived by it. He wore his work like a second skin, comfortable in its familiar grit and grime. He didn't complain. He just put his head down every day and kept turning the crank. Hector was the definition of dependable. Quietly observant, he soaked up information, noticed the small shifts in machine rhythms or the unspoken tension between coworkers, but rarely offered comment. He was reserved, didn't seek attention, and certainly never complained about the monotony or the aching in his joints. When he gave his word, it was as good as gold. His resilience was a quiet force, an unwavering sense of duty pushing him forward even when the tank felt empty. He had a knack for practical problem-solving, an almost stubborn determination once he committed to a task. If it was broken, Hector could probably figure out a way to fix it, or at least jury-rig it until the right part came in. But beneath that stoic, reliable exterior, Hector carried a different kind of weight. There was a deep-seated fear of failure that gnawed at him, not just of material ruin, but of personal inadequacy. He often felt a profound, unspoken longing for a deeper, more meaningful connection, a conversation that went beyond surface pleasantries. He had a quiet ambition, too, buried under layers of practicality and caution, dreams of learning a new trade, or perhaps just a life where his hands shaped something other than parts on an assembly line. But those were whispers in the back of his mind, easily drowned out by the everyday hum. Hector's world was a universe of predictability, a carefully constructed fortress against the unknown. His day began before the sun even thought about making an appearance. The alarm, a harsh digital squawk, tore through the silence at 5 o'clock sharp every single weekday. He'd swing his legs out of bed, the familiar ache in his lower back a morning greeting. The first order of business was coffee, strong and black, brewed while the house was still dark and hushed. He didn't read the paper. He just sat at the kitchen table, the only sound the clink of his mug and the soft whir of the refrigerator, staring out the window at the pre-dawn gray. It was a moment of quiet, an emptiness that used to be filled with the rustle of his wife, the sleepy murmur of their daughter Lily, but now it was just him watching the streetlights fade. By 5:45, he was in his beat-up Ford, the engine rumbling a complaint in the cold. The drive to the plant was always the same route, every turn, every pothole intimately known. The factory itself was a monster of metal and noise, a place where the air hung heavy with the smell of oil and hot steel. His shift started at 6. For 8 hours, sometimes 10, he was one more cog in the immense machine, his body moving through the practiced choreography of assembly. Lifting, turning, fastening, pressing, the rhythm was hypnotic, mind-numbing. The clatter of machinery, the incessant whine of the saws, the distant clang of hammers, it all merged into a single, droning soundtrack to his life. He watched the parts move down the line, an endless parade of identical components, each one needing his touch, his attention, before it disappeared into the maw of the next station. His job wasn't hard in a complex way, but it was physically demanding, and the relentless repetition was a soul-sapping kind of heavy. The paycheck, when it arrived, was a tightrope walk. Bills piled up on the worn kitchen counter. Mortgage, utilities, Lily's school expenses, the endless stream of necessities. Hector was a careful man with his money, never frivolous, always stretching every dollar. He'd scrutinize the numbers, moving funds from one column to another, making sure everything was covered just barely. There wasn't much left over for extras, for indulgences. His small, two-bedroom house in the working-class suburb, while meticulously maintained, felt more like a sanctuary from the world's demands than a place of vibrant living. The quiet that enveloped it felt less like peace and more like an absence, especially on the evenings when Lily wasn't visiting. It was neat, clean, everything in its place, but it always felt a bit too still, a bit too silent for a home that once echoed with laughter and argument. Beneath the quiet dependability and the relentless grind of his daily life, Hector carried a secret burden, an internal landscape he rarely dared to explore. The deep-seated fear of failure wasn't just about financial ruin. It was a deeper, more insidious dread of personal inadequacy, of trying something new and proving himself incapable. It manifested as a powerful tendency to prioritize comfort and routine over risk, a natural aversion to anything that might upset the delicate balance he'd established. He had long suppressed a quiet ambition, dreams that had been pushed down like stubborn weeds, replaced by the sturdy, familiar oaks of responsibility and predictability. There was a longing for something more, a hunger for meaningful connection that went beyond the casual nods at work or the perfunctory conversations with his ex-wife when Lily was dropped off. He yearned for someone to truly see him, to hear the unexpressed thoughts that cluttered his mind, but he never knew how to articulate that need. He was vulnerable to loneliness, especially when the house felt empty after Lily's visits, the silence pressing in around him like a physical weight. Hector had always believed that stability was the zenith of success. Keep your head down, don't rock the boat, find your rhythm and stick to it. This belief had become his anchor, firmly rooting him in the known, even if that known wasn't truly fulfilling. He saw comfort as a reward, a peaceful plateau after years of climbing, rather than a dangerous stagnation. He had settled for good enough, mistaking quiet contentment for the peak of happiness, allowing the fear of change to eclipse any flickering desire for growth. His suppressed ambition whispered about learning woodworking, about shaping raw timber into something beautiful and lasting, a stark contrast to the fleeting, identical parts he manufactured. He'd even bought a few books, years ago, on joinery and design, their pages now yellowed and unread on a high shelf in the garage, collecting dust alongside tools he never quite got around to mastering. Every now and then he'd glance at them, a small pang of regret, a flicker of what if, but then the practical voice would kick in. Too expensive, too much time, what if it doesn't work out? Stick to what you know. This inner conflict was a constant low-level hum, a reminder of the gap between the man he was and the man he had once, briefly, dreamed of becoming. He was comfortable, yes, but in that comfort he had slowly, almost imperceptibly, started to disappear. Then came the crack. It wasn't a sudden, shattering explosion, not a fist hitting the wall or a plate flying. It was quieter than that, a slow, deep fracture that started in the very foundation of his comfortable world. He remembered it like a snapshot frozen in his mind. A Tuesday evening just after dinner. Lily had been over for the weekend, leaving the house with that familiar, hollow echo. Hector was doing the dishes, the hum of the old dishwasher a constant companion. Maria was sitting at the kitchen table, a half-empty mug of tea in front of her, the steam long gone. He'd barely noticed her quietness, just assumed she was tired. He was humming a low tune, thinking about the quiet night ahead, maybe an early bedtime. "Hector!" Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it cut through the hum of the dishwasher like a dull knife. He turned, a dish towel in his hand, a casual smile on his face. Expected a question about tomorrow, maybe a comment about Lily's visit. Her eyes, though, were different. Not angry, not even sad, just distant, resigned, and in that distance he saw something he'd never seen before, a chasm. "I'm leaving Hector." The dish towel slipped from his hand, falling silently to the linoleum floor. The humming of the dishwasher suddenly sounded deafening, then faded into a strange, muffled quietness, as if the world had put its hand over its mouth. He felt a sudden icy chill, even though the kitchen was warm. "Leaving?" he repeated, his own voice sounding foreign, high-pitched. He thought she meant for a trip, maybe to her sister's. They hadn't fought, not really, not in years. They just existed. She sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. "I'm leaving us, Hector. I can't do this anymore." He stared at her, his mind struggling to catch up. He saw the faint lines around her eyes, the familiar curve of her lips, and in that instant she felt like a stranger. He searched for the anger, the accusation, anything he could push back against. But there was only that quiet resignation. "Why?" he managed, the single word a croak. Maria finally met his gaze, and for the first time he saw a flicker of her pain, but it was buried deep beneath a mound of weariness. "Because you stopped trying, Hector. Somewhere along the line, you just stopped. You became invisible." Invisible. The word hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Invisible. Not angry, not hurtful, just absent. He stood there, a man accustomed to the predictable rhythm of his life, suddenly unmoored, adrift in a sea of unspoken truths. He wanted to argue, to deny it, to tell her she was wrong, that he worked hard, that he provided, that he was there. But the words caught in his throat, choked by the sudden, undeniable sting of truth. He had been there, yes, but he hadn't been present. He'd been a fixture, a part of the furniture, quietly blending into the background of his own life. She didn't yell, didn't slam a door. She just stood up, gathered her mug, and walked away, leaving him in the suddenly cavernous kitchen, the only sound the slow, rhythmic drip of the faucet, counting out the seconds of his unraveling. His comfortable world, his meticulously maintained illusion of stability, had just been declared utterly, completely, and irrevocably broken. The next few hours were a blur of numb disbelief. He moved through the house like a ghost, the silence amplified by Maria's absence. He didn't eat. He didn't watch TV. He just sat, then paced, then sat again in the dim glow of the living room, waiting for the feeling to pass, for the world to right itself. It didn't. 3 a.m. That witching hour. The silence in the house was no longer comfortable. It was a gaping maw swallowing everything. Hector lay awake in his bed, the space beside him a vast, cold expanse. His eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling, seeing nothing but the relentless parade of his own failures. Invisible. He replayed Maria's words over and over, each syllable a fresh cut. Had he really become invisible? He thought of Lily, her bright, questioning eyes. Had he been invisible to her too sometimes? He'd always just assumed his quiet presence was enough. That being reliable, being there to fix things, to provide, was the ultimate expression of love. But she hadn't said he was bad. She'd said he was absent. He thought of the yellowed woodworking books in the garage, the tools gathering rust. He remembered the quiet spark of excitement he'd felt when he bought them, that flicker of ambition, long ago extinguished by the steady drip. What if it doesn't work out? And it's too much trouble. He'd chosen the comfortable certainty of the factory floor, the predictable rhythm of the punch press, over the terrifying unknown of trying to create something with his own hands. He'd chosen it again and again, until the choice wasn't even a choice anymore, just a deeply ingrained habit. He saw himself in the rearview mirror on the way to work, a man with tired eyes, a slightly stooped posture blending into the other cars on the road. He rarely looked in the mirror for long. What was there to see? Just Hector, the dependable, quiet Hector, the invisible Hector. The brutal honesty of the dark pulled him down into a cold, hard truth. He hadn't just stopped trying in his marriage, he had stopped trying at life. He had become complacent, mistaking stability for success, comfort for fulfillment. He'd built his world on the firm ground of predictability, only to find that firm ground was slowly turning into quicksand, sucking him deeper into a life devoid of passion, of risk, of true connection. He hadn't wanted to stir the pot, hadn't wanted to make waves, and in doing so, he had become a stagnant pond. A silent tear traced a path down his temple, cooling on his pillow. It wasn't just for Maria, not just for the marriage. It was for the man he was, and for the man he had let himself stop being. The fear of failure, the fear of change, had kept him tethered to the familiar, even as the familiar was slowly, agonizingly suffocating him. He was 48 years old, and the life he thought he had carefully built was crumbling around him, leaving him exposed, alone, and terrifyingly visible in his own quiet ruin. The quiet ruin. It was a cold, unfamiliar weight in his chest, a hollow ache that settled deeper than any physical pain he'd known from a long day on the factory floor. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, the streetlights outside casting long, weak shadows through the blinds. The air itself felt thin, carrying the ghost of words that had ripped his world apart just weeks ago, words that still echoed in the empty spaces of his mind like a hammer blow in a silent room. It had been a Tuesday. The kind of Tuesday that blurred into every other Tuesday. He'd come home, taken off his work boots by the door, the familiar scent of metal and oil clinging to his clothes. Maria was in the living room, perched on the edge of the sofa, hands clasped, a stillness about her that was far more unsettling than any argument. He'd barely registered it, just grunted a greeting, heading for the kitchen to grab a beer, the usual. Routine, comfort, the illusion of peace. Remembered the click of the can opening, the hiss of the carbonation, the first cold swallow. He walked back into the living room, TV murmuring some sports highlight show. Lily was upstairs, probably doing homework, music faintly thumping through the floorboards. Everything on the surface was just as it always was. "Hector," she'd said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion, like she was reading from a script. He looked over, raising an eyebrow, still sipping his beer. "I'm leaving." The words didn't register at first. They simply hung in the air, foreign objects he couldn't quite grasp. He must have misunderstood. Maybe she meant she was leaving for her mother's for a weekend trip. That sometimes happened. "What?" he'd asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Her eyes met his then, and there was a deep, unreadable sorrow in them, but also a steel he'd never seen before. "I'm leaving you, Hector." "I filed the papers. I'm moving out next month." The beer can felt suddenly heavy in his hand, then impossibly light. His mind, usually so practical, so quick to solve problems, just seized up. He felt a dull hum behind his ears. "Maria, what are you talking about?" We're fine." The words felt hollow as he said them. Even to him they sounded like a lie. She shook her head, a slow, deliberate motion. "No, Hector, we're not fine. We haven't been fine for a long time. You stopped trying. Years ago." Her gaze was unwavering, cutting through his usual defenses. "I became invisible to you. And you," she paused, a tremor in her voice this time, "you became invisible to yourself." Invisible. The word had echoed then, and it echoed now in the suffocating silence of his own bed. He remembered the fight that hadn't been a fight, just Maria laying out facts, a slow, methodical dissection of their life, of his life, until there was nothing left but bone. He tried to argue, to rationalize, to beg, but there was no spark left in her eyes for him to rekindle. She was gone long before she packed a single box. The comfort he had clung to, the predictable routine, the quiet stability he'd mistaken for happiness. It was all just an empty shell. He had been so proud of not rocking the boat, of just keeping things steady, that he hadn't noticed the boat was sinking, slowly, silently, beneath the weight of his own complacency. Back in the lonely grip of the 3 a.m. darkness, Maria's words were a cold current that ran straight to his bones. You became invisible to yourself. That was the real gut punch, not just to her but to himself. How had he let that happen? He'd buried ambitions so deep they felt like dreams from another man's life. The yearning to learn, to build, to create, it had all been systematically silenced by the seduction of routine, the promise of an undisturbed peace. He rolled onto his back, the ceiling a blurry canvas of his failures. The fear of failure, always lurking beneath the surface, had morphed into a fear of trying. It was safer to stay in the familiar, wasn't it? Safer to endure the dull ache of unfulfilled potential than to risk the sharp sting of disappointment. But what was he left with now? Not comfort, but desolation. Not peace, but a deafening silence where a life used to be. The small house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. Every quiet corner screamed of her absence, of Lily's occasional presence, of his own profound solitude. A fresh wave of terror washed over him. He was 48. Was this it? Was this the rest of his story? Just Hector, the invisible man, shuffling through the same motions until the wheels finally fell off. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the stillness. He imagined himself 20 years down the line, an older, more weathered version of the same man, alone in this quiet house, the comfort now an iron cage. The thought was unbearable. It was worse than any pain Maria's leaving had inflicted. This was the true, raw, brutal honesty of his life laid bare, a stagnant pond not just reflecting the sky, but slowly, surely festering beneath it. He sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. The floorboards were cold under his bare feet. The house groaned around him, an old, tired sound. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the stubble, the weariness etched into the lines around his eyes. He thought of Lily, her bright, inquisitive gaze, her fierce teenage spirit. He couldn't be this man for her. He couldn't teach her that settling for invisible was a life. The pain of the divorce was sharp, yes, but the pain of looking at himself, truly seeing himself through Maria's brutally honest lens, was an entirely different beast. It was a pain that demanded more than just tears. It demanded an answer. He knew with a clarity that chilled him to the bone that he couldn't keep doing this. This silent slide into oblivion, this quiet acceptance of good enough that had slowly eaten away at his life like rust on an old engine. Maria was right. He had stopped trying. Not out of malice, but out of a perverse dedication to comfort, to the familiar, to avoiding any ripple in the placid surface of his existence. It had mistaken stagnation for peace, and now the whole pond was putrid. He stood up, walking to the window. The pre-dawn darkness still held the world in its grip. He saw his reflection, a shadowy figure staring back, and for the first time he saw not just weariness but a flicker of something else. A flicker of anger, perhaps, or maybe a stubborn defiance. "No," he whispered, the sound barely audible in the quiet room. It wasn't a roar, not a declaration to the heavens. It was a guttural, exhausted refusal. No more. He didn't know what no more meant. He didn't have a plan, a roadmap, or even a single damn idea of how to unfester a life he'd spent decades carefully constructing into a perfect comfort zone. But the word once spoken felt like a small, sharp shard of truth cutting through the murky waters of his despair. It was enough for now, just no more of the slow rot. The next morning, the 5 a.m. alarm felt different. Not just a familiar blare, but a challenge. His routine, that comforting, stifling blanket, was there waiting. The worn coffee mug, the same stale cereal, the quiet drive to the factory. Everything screamed. Just go back to sleep, Hector. It's easier. But the "no more" echoed in his mind. He dragged himself out of bed. His body, accustomed to the exact timing of his morning, felt sluggish, protesting the slightest deviation. He made his coffee, but instead of settling into his armchair to stare at the news, he did something entirely foreign. He put on his old, beat-up running shoes. He hadn't run for 20 years, not since high school. The thought of it, the actual act of it, brought a wave of dread. His lungs would burn, his knees would ache, he'd probably pull something. It would be uncomfortable, undeniably. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to stop. Just sit down. Read the paper. It's too cold. You'll look ridiculous. What's the point? This was it, wasn't it? The first real test. Maria's words, "Stop trying," now felt like a brand. His fear of discomfort, his deep-seated love for the predictable and the easy, was a physical weight pushing him back towards the couch. He stood by the front door for a full 5 minutes, the silence of the house pressing in on him, the chill seeping through his thin t-shirt. His breath hitched. It was a battle right there in his hallway against himself. Finally, with a groan that was half effort, half surrender, he twisted the doorknob and stepped out into the crisp, pre-dawn air. The cold hit him first, sharp and bracing. Then the quiet, no cars, just the faint chirping of a few early birds. He started walking, slowly at first, stiff and awkward. His muscles felt like rusted hinges. He felt foolish, exposed. He tried to jog. His lungs burned instantly, a raw, searing sensation that screamed for him to stop. His legs protested, heavy and unresponsive, each step a conscious act of defiance against his own body's ingrained desire for ease. He lasted maybe 30 seconds, gasping, a painful stitch forming in his side before he had to slow back to a clumsy walk. He felt a profound sense of failure, a confirmation of every doubt. See, this is why you don't do things. This is why you stay comfortable. You're not cut out for it. You're just Hector, the quiet man who sits still. But then another thought, quieter but more insistent, cut through the self-pity. No, this is exactly why you have to. He kept walking, one foot in front of the other, pushing through the burning in his chest, the dull ache in his knees. He didn't go far, maybe a mile, 2 at the most, but it felt like a marathon. By the time he circled back to his house, he was sweating, breathless, and utterly miserable. And yet, as he pulled off his shoes and stood in the shower, the hot water beating down on his aching muscles, a strange sensation stirred within him. It wasn't joy, not yet. It was a faint, almost imperceptible hum of something. Maybe it was just the blood pumping, the oxygen finally reaching parts of him that had been dormant for too long. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the first faint stirrings of life in a man who had been slowly drying up in the sun. He hadn't accomplished anything grand. He hadn't solved his problems. But he had chosen discomfort. He had picked a fight with his own inertia, and for the first time in a long time, he hadn't immediately surrendered. The quiet man had finally, agonizingly taken a step into the unknown, and it felt like a victory, however small, however painful. The victory, small as it was, didn't make the next morning any easier. Hector woke up to his 5 a.m. alarm, his body a symphony of aches he hadn't heard in years. Every muscle screamed in protest, especially his calves, which felt like they'd been stretched on a medieval rack. The thought of lacing up those dusty sneakers again, stepping out into the pre-dawn chill, was almost unbearable. He lay there for a long minute negotiating with himself. Just today, the voice of comfort whispered in his ear, soft and tempting. Just one day off, you earned it. You'll go tomorrow. He closed his eyes, picturing the quiet house, the empty space at the breakfast table. He thought of Lily, her bright, expectant eyes. He thought of Sarah's words. You stopped trying. It wasn't just about the walk, he knew. It was about trying. It was about fighting that whisper. With a groan that vibrated through his whole skeleton, Hector swung his legs over the side of the bed. The floor felt impossibly cold against his bare feet. He dressed slowly, each movement a conscious effort, pulling on the same worn track pants and a thick sweatshirt. Stepping outside felt like plunging into an icy bath, the air biting at his exposed skin. His breath plumed white in front of him. This time he didn't even try to jog. He just walked, one foot, then the other, a grim, determined shuffle around the block, then another. It wasn't glorious, it wasn't fast, but he did it. Day 3 arrived with the persistent drizzle of an early spring, the kind of rain that wasn't quite a downpour but seemed to seep into your bones. It was the perfect excuse. He could almost feel the warmth of his bed calling him back, the promise of an extra hour of sleep. He could just spend the time reading the paper, sipping coffee, and tell himself he'd make it up later. That familiar, comforting path of least resistance stretched out before him, wide and inviting. But Hector paused, his hand on the doorknob. He looked out the window at the gray, weeping morning. He thought about all the other days he'd chosen that path, all the quiet surrenders, the small compromises that over years had added up to a life that was stable, yes, but also stagnant. He remembered the faint hum he'd felt after that first painful walk, a promise of something more than just existing. He pulled on a thin rain jacket, the hood cinched tight around his face, and stepped out. The rain immediately plastered his hair to his forehead and ran in cold rivulets down his neck. The streetlights cast long, distorted reflections on the wet asphalt. Every step was a squelch, every breath a cloud. He felt ridiculous, a solitary figure trudging through the rain, probably the only person crazy enough to be out there. He hated it. He hated the cold, the wet, the ache in his knees that seemed to worsen with each passing day. He wanted to turn back, to retreat to the predictable warmth of his home. Yet, a stubbornness, a quality he hadn't realized he still possessed, rooted him to his course. He kept going, the rhythm of his footsteps a dull mantra against the drumming rain. He didn't feel good. He felt miserable. But underneath the misery, something else was forming, something solid and unyielding. It was the knowledge that he was doing something he absolutely did not want to do, simply because he had decided to do it. And that, in its own quiet way, was a profound shift. By day 7, the physical pain had become less sharp, more of a dull, familiar companion. But the mental battle was just getting started. The novelty of his new routine had worn off, replaced by the grind. His job at the factory felt heavier, the noise louder, the hours longer. The stack of bills on the kitchen counter seemed to grow rather than shrink. He still felt tired, always tired. What was the point? He wasn't thinner. He wasn't happier. He was just exhausted. One morning his alarm went off and he instinctively reached to silence it, pulling the covers higher. He lay there, drifting, the warmth of the bed a sweet, irresistible embrace. 5 minutes turned into 10, 10 into 20. The sun was already starting to peek over the horizon when he finally snapped awake, a jolt of guilt shooting through him. He'd almost done it. He'd almost let comfort win. Again, he swore under his breath, scrambling out of bed. He threw on his clothes, skipping the stretches, practically running out the door. He managed a shorter walk than usual, his mind racing with self-recrimination. He felt like a failure, like all his efforts were for nothing, a fragile house of cards collapsing at the first strong gust. The old patterns of thought, the ones that told him to just settle, to give up, were incredibly powerful. They were like deep ruts in the road, easy to fall back into. But the shame of almost giving up, the sting of that momentary surrender, was a different kind of pain than the physical aches. It was a pain that spurred him on. It reminded him of Sarah's words, of the invisible man he had become. This time he wouldn't let himself become invisible even to himself. He wouldn't let the comfort of the covers win. He would show up, even if it was just to prove to himself that he could still show up. Day 14, 2 full weeks. He was still showing up. The mornings were still dark, still cold, but they had lost some of their sting. He was walking further now, sometimes even managing a steady jog for a few minutes at a time. The world was beginning to look different at that hour. He started noticing the way the streetlights faded just before dawn, the first birdsong, the crisp, clean smell of the air before the city woke up. He wouldn't say he enjoyed it yet. That was a long way off. It was still a chore, a discipline. There were still days he woke up feeling drained, wondering if it was all for nothing. Days where the wind howled and the icy air burned his lungs, where his old joints ached with a deep, persistent throb. He still felt the pull of the easy way out, the temptation to just stop, to go back to the familiar, predictable comfort he had known for so long. But something had subtly changed. The internal arguments were still there, but they were different. Less about if he should go, and more about how he would push through. The voice of comfort was still loud, but now there was another voice, one he was slowly cultivating, a voice of quiet resolve. It wasn't about feeling good anymore. It was about honoring the commitment he had made to himself, to Lily, to the ghost of the man he wanted to be. Every morning, as he pushed through the discomfort, he was slowly, painfully rebuilding something lost. He was proving to himself, step by agonizing step, that he wasn't invisible after all. He was still here, still fighting. The mornings were still dark, still cold, but they had lost some of their sting. He was walking further now, sometimes even managing a steady jog for a few minutes at a time. The world was beginning to look different at that hour. He started noticing the way the streetlights faded just before dawn, the first birdsong, the crisp, clean smell of the air before the city woke up. He wouldn't say he enjoyed it yet. That was a long way off. It was still a chore, a discipline. There were still days he woke up feeling drained, wondering if it was all for nothing. Days where the wind howled and the icy air burned his lungs, where his old joints ached with a deep, persistent throb. He still felt the pull of the easy way out, the temptation to just stop, to go back to the familiar, predictable comfort he had known for so long. But something had subtly changed. The internal arguments were still there, but they were different. Less about if he should go, and more about how he would push through. The voice of comfort was still loud, but now there was another voice, one he was slowly cultivating, a voice of quiet resolve. It wasn't about feeling good anymore. It was about honoring the commitment he had made to himself, to Lily, to the ghost of the man he wanted to be. Every morning, as he pushed through the discomfort, he was slowly, painfully rebuilding something lost. He was proving to himself, step by agonizing step, that he wasn't invisible after all. He was still here, still fighting. Then, around the 3rd week, something clicked. It wasn't a sudden burst of energy, no Hollywood montage of triumphant jogs. It was quieter than that. One morning, the air didn't burn quite so much. His lungs still protested, but a little less fiercely. He noticed a sense of clarity, a quiet hum in his mind that wasn't there before. It was the feeling of a clean engine running smoother. The world still looked the same, but Hector's eyes saw it with a new, almost sharp focus. He still craved that extra half-hour of sleep, but the discomfort of getting out of bed was now an expected, almost welcomed part of the process. It was a tax paid for the clarity that followed. Others started to notice, not with big comments, not right away, just little things. At the factory, Marco, who usually saw Hector as just another pair of hands on the line, frowned. "You look different, Hector, like you actually slept." Hector just grunted, not knowing what to say, but a small, unfamiliar warmth sparked in his chest. His movements at the machinery became a bit more fluid, his attention less prone to drifting. He caught problems before they became big ones, anticipated the next step with a quiet efficiency that hadn't been there in years. He even started offering solutions to small bottlenecks that had long been accepted as just the way things were. Old habits were still ingrained, but the deep-seated weariness that had masked his natural competence was slowly receding. The biggest shift, though, was in his home, especially with Lily. She came over one Saturday, and instead of him just asking about school and then retreating to the couch while she watched her phone, he was present. He asked about her friends, really listened to her rambling about a band she liked. He even offered to help her fix a loose wheel on her skateboard, something he would have put off or just told her to take to the shop before. As he worked, kneeling on the garage floor, the grease on his hands familiar, he found himself talking to her, really talking about his day, about a tricky weld he'd done, about the crazy pigeon that kept trying to build a nest inside the exhaust vent at work. Lily didn't look up from her phone much, but he saw her shoulders relax, her head cock a little to the side. She was listening. He was no longer just the silent, comfortable furniture of her visits. A month turned into 2. The physical changes were more pronounced now. Hector was leaner, his shoulders a little straighter, his face less puffy with the telltale signs of too much sedentary comfort. His clothes fit better. The quiet ambition he'd long suppressed, the one that used to make him sketch designs for better tool organization or more efficient assembly lines on scrap paper, started to resurface. He found himself staying a few minutes after his shift, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine desire to finish a small improvement he'd started. He wasn't trying to be the foreman, not looking for a promotion, just finding a quiet satisfaction in doing a good job, a better job. He was no longer just going through the motions, he was engaging. He found himself spending more time in his small, tidy house, but not in quiet resignation. He started tackling the backlog of small repairs he'd let slide, the leaky faucet, the squeaky door hinge, the half-painted trim in the guest bedroom that had been almost done for 3 years. Each task, small as it was a tangible victory against the inertia that had once gripped him. The house, while still quiet, no longer felt empty. It felt like a space he was actively inhabiting, improving, making his own. One evening, his ex-wife, Sarah, dropped Lily off. She usually just handed her over at the door, exchanged a few clipped words about schedules. But this time she paused. "Hector," she said, her voice softer than he'd heard it in a long time. You look well." It wasn't a question, just an observation, tinged with a surprise he recognized. He just nodded, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. He didn't try to explain or justify. He didn't need to. The change wasn't for her or for anyone else, not anymore. It was for him. He had found a steady rhythm, a new baseline. The fear of failure was still there, a whisper in the back of his mind, but it was now overshadowed by the quiet hum of his own resilience, a renewed belief in his capacity to adapt, to grow. He was rediscovering the man he once was, and perhaps, more importantly, becoming the man he was always meant to be. The discomfort was still a companion, but now it was the grit in the oyster, slowly, painfully, forging something precious. The discomfort was still a companion, but now it was the grit in the oyster, slowly, painfully, forging something precious. Lily felt it too. Not in the way Sarah did, with an adult's understanding of past grievances, but with a teenager's sharp, unclouded perception. One Saturday morning, instead of their usual quiet breakfast and then Lily retreating to her phone, Hector suggested something unexpected. "Hey, there's that old hiking trail by the reservoir. Haven't been there in years. Wanna go?" Lily looked up from her cereal, her eyebrows raised in genuine surprise. Her dad suggesting an activity. A walk maybe, but a hike felt different. It felt like an invitation. She hesitated, then shrugged, a small smile playing on her lips. "Sure, Dad, why not?" That hike was a revelation. Hector didn't just walk. He pointed out birds, talked about the history of the reservoir, even told a half-forgotten story about trying to skip rocks there as a kid and falling in. Asked Lily about her friends, her classes, her dreams for after high school, and he didn't just listen for a break in the conversation. He heard her, nodded, asked follow-up questions. He was present, truly present. It was a lightness he hadn't felt in years, a joy that surprised them both. They came home tired, but with a different kind of quiet, a comfortable, shared quiet, filled with the resonance of connection. At the factory, the change was more subtle, but present nonetheless. An afternoon, a critical machine went down, spewing hydraulic fluid. In the past, Hector would have waited for a supervisor, kept his head down, just another pair of hands in the recovery. But this time, he saw a blockage. He remembered a diagram from an old manual he'd barely glanced at years ago, a troubleshooting section he'd dismissed as not his job. He didn't wait. He spoke up calmly, pointing to a potential culprit, an obscure valve that no one else was considering. The supervisor, a grizzled veteran named Frank, looked at him, surprised. "You sure, Hector?" Hector nodded, a quiet conviction in his eyes. They checked it. He was right. The problem was fixed an hour faster than it would have been, saving the line significant downtime. Frank just clapped him on the shoulder. "Good call, man, real good call." It wasn't about being a hero. It was about engaging, about leaning into the discomfort of offering an opinion, of potentially being wrong, of standing out. And it paid off. These small victories, at home and at work, began to stitch together a new fabric of his life. He found himself signing up for an evening welding course at the community college, something he'd always been curious about, but never had the time or energy for. The class was full of younger guys, and Hector felt a bit out of place, his hands, calloused from years of repetitive factory work, feeling clumsy with the new tools. He was terrible at first. Frustrated, he'd almost given up after the second session, the old familiar urge to retreat to the known, the comfortable, pulling at him. But then he remembered the ache in his chest when Sarah had left, the hollow loneliness, the stark realization that comfort had been a cage. He went back. And the next week, and the week after that, gradually the weld beads became straighter, stronger. The feeling of the arc striking, the intense heat and light, it was a new kind of satisfaction. One night, looking at his daughter across the dinner table, really seeing her, Hector felt a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the food. Her eyes, so much like her mother's, sparkled with a youthful energy he hadn't truly appreciated before. He cleared his throat. "Lily." He said, "I'm sorry." She looked up, confused. "Sorry for what, Dad?" He took a breath, the words feeling heavy, honest. "Sorry for not always being here, not really here, for letting things get comfortable, for not trying hard enough for you, for us." Lily's gaze softened. She reached across the table and took his hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "It's okay, Dad," she said. "You're here now." And he was. He was right here in that slightly outdated, meticulously maintained house, which no longer felt too quiet. It felt full, not with noise, but with intent, with the quiet hum of a life actively lived. He'd learned the hard way that a comfortable life wasn't always a living one. He'd thought keeping things quiet and steady was the way to go. Just keep your head down, don't stir the pot. But sometimes, staying comfortable just meant you're rotting slow. Losing his wife, it hurt like hell, it shattered his world, but it shook him awake. You gotta be willing to feel a little uneasy.